Hello everyone, thank you so much for coming to our fourth and final workshop for this series. My name is Cheech Flores and I'm the founder of Visión Tolteca. This is our first program, Black and Brown in the IE and Beyond. Unfortunately, one of our main organizers, Juan Kellum, wasn't able to show up today, but thanks to him, thanks to the Cheech, thanks to Rachel Manchego, we were able to put this together. So the idea behind this is to be able to dismantle a bunch of assumptions that we are all separate communities. Visión Tolteca is a company that was founded a couple years ago, and for many that don't know, the story of the Tolteca is an oral history that has been passed down from generation to generation because, as it is no mystery to us, a lot of our history has only survived in that way. So let me share a little bit of how this whole thing is connected. It has been said in the past that the Tolteca is a mysterious race of peoples that may or may not have existed, much like Atlanteans and other peoples that were known for ancient technologies. Now we know that even the Aztecs considered themselves to be descendants of this great race. But what I'm going to tell you now is that this race is not limited to a bloodline. The Tolteca, as translated, means artist or artisan or craftsman. The Tolteca were a civilization made by different peoples that got together to be able to use art not just to create pretty things that we can see and admire and spend money on, but rather a kind of divine origin made manifest through architecture, through science, through history, through storytelling, and through various forms of art. Black and Brown in the IE is supposed to help us understand that our history is much more than the limitations that we have come to know it, and much more than the limitations of our color or our supposed origin, and that we are, throughout history and today, creating stories, and that we have much more in common than we have differences, and the differences can all be celebrated. So this is the purpose of the project, and it is a heartfelt thank you and offering to the community by Visión Tolteca in collaboration with the Cheech. And I'm very honored today to have our presenter, Anthony Victoria, who is a reporter, KVCR and NPR, and will be also telling some stories, sharing some knowledge and techniques in terms of what is happening in the IE and the very intimate work that he has been doing with it. So thank you very much, and then stay for the art portion afterwards. I'll be giving more of an explanation with that as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, everybody. Yeah, so good evening. My name is Anthony Victoria. So just to kind of give some background and to kind of build a little bit on what she shared, right? I think when people think journalism, they think, you know, it's kind of rigid, right? You're pursuing a story, right? You're feeding the beast. That's a term that we use a lot in the NPR network, right? Feeding the beast, making sure our newscast is thriving, people are getting daily news. I think sometimes, though, as reporters, we don't stop to think about the bigger issues, right? The bigger stories that are impacting the communities we cover, but also us individually, right? And so, you know, for me, I'm a journalist, but I see my journalism as an art. I see it as a means to empower people, so I just want to kind of start with that. Like, you know, my craft is journalism. My craft is, you know, things like photography, right? Like doing interviews with people, that sort of thing. And I've done that both as a reporter, and I've also done it as you know, a media strategist, a photographer, what have you, right? I worked with a lot of, or some folks in this room to kind of share these stories. And so, you know, I've had the privilege and the honor to work alongside different environmental justice groups to, you know, speak to community members about the issues that they're facing, but also to uplift the advocacy efforts and the solutions that they're presenting to our communities, right? My hope with my presentation is to just give you all insight on what I've covered, give you all maybe some insight on the history of like the IE, because I think sometimes, you know, I don't know about you all, but I grew up here. I've lived here for like 23 years now. You know, the narrative of the IE for the last maybe 20 to 30 years has been a downtrodden community that struggles, that has community members that are struggling to survive, that maybe aren't as smart as like LA or Orange County, or things aren't as like vibrant, right? But what I've learned through my work is that that's far from the truth, right? And that in reality, our community, this small place that people sometimes like to kind of step on, is very crucial to the larger economy. And not only that, it's always been a strategic place of movement, right? I don't know if you could go to the next slide, please. So we can't talk about understanding warehousing, goods movement, logistics, all that stuff, without necessarily talking about the past and honoring the people that have, that lived in this land, right? That were the original descendants of this land, right? I think you went too far.
Technical difficulties, apologies.
No worries. Yeah, but anyway, I'm sorry. As I was saying, you have, the Yuhabiatam, you have the Kwakuya Indians, right, or the native folks here that lived in these communities that, were essential, right, that used the corridors of the Cajon Pass and all these different places, right, to move goods, to trade, to do all these different things. And so I just want to share this because I think we need to, recognize that and honor those folks that are the original descendants of this land, right? And we can't start without acknowledging that these folks have been here, they've always been here, and they will continue to be here, right? And that if anything, they were the ones that used trade and goods movement in a means that was balanced, in my opinion, in my personal opinion, And so, hopefully through this tale that I share, you can kind of see how we've swayed from those practices, right? And how a lot of advocates in this environmental justice movement, local movement, are sort of learning from these folks, right? From some of the ancestors, right? Even in our own culture, and trying to build on that, right? So I just want to acknowledge that. Next slide, please. Okay, so, I can go on a spiel about history, right? But I'm not going to do that. But I want to fast forward to a little bit of modern history, right? By modern history, I mean maybe the last 150 to 200 years, maybe, in our region, right? A lot of you are maybe familiar with this history, right? Obviously, a lot of you maybe grew up here and you've seen, right, how citrus groves were once prominent, right? How you had acres and acres of citrus, right? And you see some of those remnants today in places like Redlands, right? If you all didn't know this, BNSF and Santa Fe actually had basically a capitalist war in Colton over the crossings, right? So if you're on Valley Boulevard, you're driving on Valley and you pass the 10 and you see an area where you see two rail lines crossing, believe it or not, that might look like an ordinary thing, but that actually was the place where you had two companies that were literally willing to start a war, right, and hire henchmen on both sides to basically kill each other for land, and it happened right here in Colton, right? And that eventually led to not only the birth of cities like Colton, right? Because Colton was once a settlement called San Salvador, and across from that settlement was another settlement, La Placita, which is now North Riverside, right? There's a lot of folks that used to live there that are descendants of some of the native tribes that I mentioned, but also other folks that came through colonization, right? Like the Spaniards, Mexicans, and others. Long story short, what I'm trying to get at is towns like Colton, towns like Rialto, unincorporated areas like Bloomington, were all born out of this industry, both these industries, right? The railroads and the citrus industries, right? If you go in the archives and you search, right? And if y'all want to write this down, there's a great website called the People's History IE, where I've worked with a lot of great artists to produce history and archives and narratives about this stuff, right? You'll find that, citrus companies were plotting company towns, and these company towns are now Bloomington, are now places like Grand Terrace. So think about that, right? Because all these different towns you see today are remnants of this empire, right? And it's all connected to today. Next slide, please. So the way I like to talk about these issues, right, and others like to talk about sort of the shifts and the transitions, are through this concept called the slow violence of the supply chain, right? The slow violence of the supply chain. I forget the academics, but there's an academic that coined this term to basically demonstrate the fact that sometimes violence isn't inherently, it's not up in your face. Sometimes it's seen in the form of things like, I'm thinking things like the Bracero program, for example, right? In my opinion, that's an example of a slow violence because, you had a population of hard workers, Mexicans primarily, right? Who came to this country, right, seeking an opportunity, got that opportunity, but then, as time went on, their bodies were depleted. A lot of them were subjected to violence, right, humiliation at the hands of the United States government, and then sometimes maybe even their own government, right? And the same thing with, even the fruit pickers of the industries I was talking about, right? The citrus industry. There was a lot of exploitation. There's a lot of violence in those situations. And so, sometimes it's not necessarily the up and front violence, but it's more of that slow violence, right? So if you think about our communities today with warehousing, right? What do you think of? You think of trucks passing through every day, right? Maybe you're on the road, right? This would happen a lot with my dad. He would say, man, I worked 25 years as a truck driver, and I felt over the years my body just depleted. And I was just in a truck, right? Driving all day. But that's the point, right? It was a slow depletion of his body, of his health, of his mind. And think about all the people that work from, in LA and drive all the way to the IE, right? All the miles, all the hours they're putting in, right? Think about the people that work in the warehouses and go from warehouse to warehouse, right? Think about that, right? So I know I'm kind of fast forwarding, but it's all connected, I promise. The military obviously is a stronghold here, right? You see Norton, you see March Air Force Base, and you see other places that maybe are or maybe not as familiar, right? Who's familiar with Arlanza? Who's familiar with the west side of Riverside, right? So that place, that whole community was once actually a military installation, right? Soldiers, before going to war, right, would leave their last rites there, right? Others would get married there, right? It was a place of industry. It was a place of militarization, right? Fast forward to today, what's there, right? Some industry. You have a local airport at Norton Air Force Base. That's the home of Amazon Air now, right? So that whole airport has now been turned into a logistics hub. So you're kind of seeing the patterns here, right? Next slide, please. But that industry didn't survive, right? The post-war boom didn't survive quite long. It was maybe a 30 to 40 year period of growth, of economic prosperity, but challenges would lie ahead, right? One of those challenges was obviously globalization. Well, not necessarily globalization, but free trade, right? Neoliberalism, particularly, think things like NAFTA, think things like, companies like Amazon, Walmart, and others, relying on cheaper labor perhaps, right? Not wanting to pay workers as much perhaps, and just other things that shaped our local economy, right? So this is Norton obviously being closed. The memories are gone, or it's gone, but memories will not be forgotten, right? But in my research and in my conversations with a lot of historians and also people that worked at the Air Force Base, right? I don't want to speak for Dwan, but I remember actually Dwan having a conversation with Dwan about how his father used to work at Norton Air Force Base, right? And how even his father would see, yeah, sure, it was a decent job, but I wasn't paid as much as some of the white servicemen, right, that were at the base, right? And I used to work for a local paper called the Colton Courier, right, and the El Chicano, and we would talk to a lot of World War II veterans, right? A lot of them have unfortunately passed on. But a lot of those veterans actually used to work at Norton, and what they would share with us is, we still had shitty jobs. We still had shitty pay. So this narrative that has been kind of dominant, right, of, white prosperity in all-American city in San Bernardino, right, which to some extent San Bernardino was prosperous, right? It was a place where celebrities and others would come, right, to kind of share and delight. But it was also a place where segregation existed, right? Where a freeway expansion divided an entire economy, a Mexican economy, right, that was thriving on Route 66. It was divided because of this vision of white America, right? So keep that in mind, right? It's kind of, there's patterns here, right? There's patterns. And so this Cold War era decline though, right? After the Cold War died down, obviously that ended. That led to the closure of Norton. That led to the closure of other military installations. And so places that maybe you're familiar with, like who's familiar with March JPA? Does that sound familiar? March Joint Powers Authority. March Joint Powers Authority is an agency that oversees development here in Riverside, right, at the Air Force Base. There's another agency by the name of the Inland Valley Development Agency that oversees development at San Bernardino International Airport, right? Those agencies were tasked with developing the future of the Inland Empire, right? And so, you know, just to put it into perspective, I'm 33 years old, right? So my whole lifetime was spent building out the logistics empire that exists today, right? And so, you know, when a lot of us were coming of age, were being born, there was already plans to make this America's shopping cart, right? So think of that planning, 30 years. These agencies were created to basically take this economic decline and turn it into, you know, basically America's shopping cart. Next slide. So, you know, I'm not gonna go too much into this because I'm sure a lot of you all live it every day, right? A lot of you all see the trucks. A lot of you all see the warehouses. Maybe some of you, live right next to a warehouse. Maybe live a few feet away from a warehouse, right? That's kind of the reality we've been seeing. In my reporting, I've spoken to people who have lived literally 50 to 60 feet away from a warehouse in Bloomington. I've spoken to people who can't go outside because they've had lung transplants because of, you know, exposures to contaminants, both from working in harmful places and also breathing harmful pollution, right, from living next to these warehouse hubs, right? Again, in the last 20 to 30 years, right, planning agencies like the Southern California Association of Governments, and I can go on and list all these different agencies, but at the end of the day, the plan was clear to shift our economy from one that was selling the idea of good jobs and, you know, a middle-class economy, right, for all, to a reality that actually is not doing that for anybody, right? Not even white Americans, I would argue, right? Because you look at the data, right? And I think I want to make something clear, right? I'm a reporter, right? So I try to look at both sides of the story, right? So for example, I speak to economists, I speak to warehouse developers, and a lot of them will share, well, unemployment has gone down, right? The unemployment rate is now at like, you know, I think a couple years ago, and I would need to double check this, or y'all can fact check me. But at some points it's been at 4%, 7%, right? It's fluctuated here and there. And economists have tried to say, well, look, the unemployment rate is low, the IE is improving, more people have jobs, right? But how many of those people have sustaining jobs? How many of those people have to work 2 jobs or 3 jobs, or have to, you know, rely on their family members to sustain the rent and all these different things, right? You know, and so I think it's very frustrating, even as a reporter, to see community members pour their hearts and souls out, right? Talk about burying their loved ones. Talk about having to go to the hospital, right, because of their asthma or their COPD. And have developers and city councils basically go up and say, you know what, like, we're gonna override this, you know, the considerations of our community, right? We're gonna override the data that shows that we're a very smog and polluted community, right? And I think that's what drives me to do the work, right? That's what drives me to be in this space with you all today, to share my insight, right? And I know I'm doing a lot of this, but I hope this kind of inspires y'all to think and think about how you want to create these messages, because I think the message is clear from a lot of people, right? And I think this is the frustrating thing. The message that a lot of people want our lawmakers to understand is that this isn't the solution, right? That this pattern of destruction, right? And we're not just talking ecological, natural, land destruction. We're talking the destruction of cultures. We're talking the destruction of families, we're talking the destruction of jobs, of opportunities, the destruction of dreams. You know, think about it, right? Think about that for a minute, you know? When I talk about culture, Bloomington, right? A place with so much land, that used to have so much beautiful land. Places like South Colton that used to have a mountain that was maybe like 10,000 feet that you could see off the freeway. Well, maybe 10,000 feet is exaggerating, but you know, a very tall mountain you could see off the freeway. Mount Tahualpa, right? Land of the Ravens, right? It's gone. And you know what sits there today, y'all? Crates, cargo crates. Cargo crates, it's a mountain of cargo crates. And so, that's the cost, is the culture of our Native American brothers and sisters, right? Culture, you know, charreria, you know, Mexican, you know, vaqueros who come to the U.S., migrate with their families, and they say, you know what? Maybe I'm not home, but I have enough land to rent to be able to create a place where me and my family can live and thrive and survive. And maybe, yeah, I have to work a 9-to-5 job, I have to survive, but you know what? I can sustain my family, and I could do something for my community by you know, having cabalgatas. Cabalgatas in Spanish just means like, you know, it's cowboy processions, right? Sometimes you'll see cowboys ride, you know, in Muscoy or in Bloomington, right? There was a man by the name of Felipe Ortiz that I met who had a dream of just living on a small ranch and living with his family and showing his kids the way of you know, being a vaquero. His family was pushed out by a developer by the name of Howard Industrial Partners, right? And I'm not exaggerating. I'm not even trying to be sensationalist or anything like that. He was pushed out because they built a 213-acre warehouse project, right? His dream is gone. Now he's forced to live in an apartment somewhere. Now he's forced to rent for another renter. Now he can't do what he wants, right? But because of the community, but because of the activism, because of the advocacy, because of the love that people have for their communities, right? They found a place for him to go, right? They're in a community center like this, trying to show people, make people envision, right, the equestrian lifestyle that they had. But imagine being reduced to a small community room when in reality you should have a whole park, a whole space to do that with. Think about that, right? I'm gonna share a personal story. I don't do this a lot, right? You know, I'm a news reporter. We're taught to be objective. We're taught to be fair. We're taught to be accurate and to get both sides of the story. You know how hard it is to be fair when you have a loved one who died of cancer, who lived right next to a rail yard, who could have maybe avoided a premature death, right? And still have to go in front of a developer and be like, hey, you know, I'm gonna ask these questions and try to be cordial with you, even though I know you really don't give a shit, right? About the people that look like me, right? But you know why I do it, y'all? You know why I go to those developers? Because I'm not doing it for myself, you know? I'm doing it for the person next to me. I'm doing it for my wife, maybe, who's in the room, right? I'm doing it for my friend Freddie, right, who's in the room. I'm doing it for you, right? Maybe I don't know you, but I know you live here. I know maybe you have the same frustrations I do, or at the very least the same insight or the curiosity of learning those questions, right? What I see in this community every single day is a lack of understanding, a lack of engagement, and a lack of inclusion that is keeping us behind, right? The logistics industry, warehousing, is just a macro example of how, as humanity, as human beings, we fail to understand the importance of land, the importance of nature, the importance of just having space to think and to be clear and to have the creativity to do something you love and that you cherish, right? Instead, we have an industry that forces you to think on your toes, right? To try to beat the 215 and the 91 and the 60 and the 15 and whatever freeways exist in this community, right? And try to beat traffic every day, right? And try to navigate away from the trucks. That's the reality. And it forces us to think on our toes. It forces us to move away from having the ability to just slow down, you know? Think about that. Think about that, y'all. I want you to really think about that, right? Next slide, please. I'm sorry, I stayed on this slide for a minute. You know, next slide. I mean, this is just a kid, you know, next to a rail yard. My mom used to live next to that rail yard, right? This is what I'm talking about, though. You see the, oh no, you can't play that. It's just a screenshot. You see the contrast. This is 1960. This is Bryn Mawr. So Bryn Mawr, you go down there now, it's like all developed. There's like new housing tracts. There's a bunch of warehousing and stuff. But Bryn Mawr has always been a Mexican Chicano barrio, you know? Mexican families, braceros, day laborers settled here, right? People that used to be in the bracero program settled here and had families here, right? But think about it. This is a picker from Amazon. This is a picker in the citrus groves. What's the difference, y'all? What's the difference, right? What's the difference? The difference is the time, the setting, and the place. But the practice, the imagery, what do you see there, right? Next slide, please. So these are some of the folks, right? So this is the family I'm telling you about, right? Mario Juarez had 2 lung transplants. So this is pre-pandemic, by the way, pre-pandemic. Wearing a mask, immunocompromised. He's outdoors more than 15 minutes, you might have complications. That's the reality. When people are like, well, the air is not that bad, and no disrespect to any elders in the room here, but when people are like, the air is not that bad, y'all. I remember back in the day, we weren't able to see all, you know, through the clouds of the smog and the smoke. We get that. But the particle matter that these trucks emit, the pollution might not be as visible, but the harms exist. The data is there. The proof is there, right? And these strong, powerful folks are actually mothers, right? From different parts of Latin America and other parts of the world who gathered to do truck counts, right? To basically go down their neighborhoods and say, you know what? We're going to go down and count some trucks today, right? I had the privilege of being with them to document this stuff. But, you know, on an hour, you know, we're trying to basically prove to the California Air Resources Board that, you know, the data shows that we have X amount of trucks coming in our neighborhood an hour. Compare that to your actual data, you'll see we're not bullshitting you, right? We're not just here blowing smoke up your ass. Excuse my language. But so they did that. Compare the data, guess what? There's like 480 trucks down this corridor, I-215. Data matches up. This corridor, you know, do the math. That's like 20,000 truck trips, right? A day. Guess what? SCAG's data shows. Same thing, right? So people not just standing on their laurels, right? Not just accepting it. Doing everything they can to fight, advocate, push back, right? I was a part of those folks at one point pushing back. I decided, nah, I'm gonna push back through my art, through my reporting, right? That's the best way I can help. But yeah, I mean, you know, I don't need to tell you all this. I mean, y'all live it every day, right? Next slide. Yeah, so last slide, and then, you know, I can open it up for questions or anything, but I know journalism is kind of in the spotlight right now, right? Especially from the right. The right is like shitting on us every day on how we're fake news, misinforming people, misinforming the public, whatnot. The left says we're not too critical, you know, we're not critical enough, we're not pushy enough, we're not like challenging people enough. Well, hey, what I say is we're playing a crucial role, y'all. Not everybody's gonna like us, not everybody's gonna agree with us, right? We're gonna get pushback from every side and whatever, but in my belief, journalists are the one asking the questions. They're the ones willing enough to be in the spaces, right? And how we define journalism has changed, right? I've learned through a lot of art makers that, hey man, you're just as much of a journalist as I am, you know? When you're down to be in the communities that are most impacted, right? Like again, like I know folks who have taught me like, nah, you can't just be at home behind a computer, right? You gotta be out in the community and you gotta talk to people. You gotta walk your neighborhoods and not bullshit people, right? Because people will smell the bullshit, right? And I think that's what journalism is like getting out there talking to your community, doing this, right? Like, I appreciate this, right? Even if, some of y'all are like, hey, bro, we get it. Like, you're preaching to the choir, right? But, like, it's shaping that public discourse so y'all can tell us what you want to hear, what you want to read, what you want to understand, And I think I've had the honor to not only be both a community organizer, but be a journalist. And the reason why I love being a journalist is because I love listening to people. I love learning from people. And I think we can learn from each other, And so I think the way I see my life, the way I see the work I do is, if I can influence one person to say, well, you know what? I read your story, I saw your image, I want to do something. Or you know what? Like, I want to ask you some questions, right? And that's a start. Because that's the whole point, y'all, is for us to get out of our comfort zones and engage with each other. I would argue things like this exist, right? Warehousing and pollution. Dare I say, like the brain drain that people talk about of great talent leaving our area for different areas, right? Like, that stuff supposedly exists because we're not engaging in dialogue. But you know what I say to that? I say, what brain drain? Right? The talent exists. The people are here. It's just we're not talking to each other, right? We're not engaging with each other. We're not trying to get to solutions that really bring us more together than they tear us apart, right? And I don't want to minimize things because there's a lot of shit going on in this world. But I think when it comes to my community, when it comes to the Inland Empire, what I'll say is, because of the advocacy, because of the movement work, because of all this different stuff, right? There's a shift in the public discourse happening now around warehousing, right? People are beginning to say, you know what, enough with warehousing. We don't want warehousing in our communities no more, right? We just saw a whole agency reject the warehouse in Riverside the other day, right? So there's a shift, and that shift is happening because people are beginning to talk to each other, right? And so I think the last thing I'll share is, why do I believe in environmental justice? Why do I believe just in racial justice or justice in general? Is because, I don't know. I just feel like when people are silent, it's like what's the point, Like, and I think that's why my encouragement to you all is, again, like, use this art, use this opportunity to be in this space, in this room, to share a message, to send a message, right? And to make your voice heard, right? And, I just appreciate the time. I know I've been doing a lot of talking at you, but I'm just really passionate about my work, about my journalism, about being able to talk to people, being able to shape these stories for my community, but more importantly, being able to learn from folks, right? So yeah, thanks for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions if folks have any questions, or maybe even comments of what y'all think or anything else. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you for mentioning this history of America. I think that needs to be publicized even more than America. And if it's possible, we should go to a conference so amazing. And the very diverse stories and histories that we're not going to hear anywhere else.
Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you for being here.
Of course, yeah. I mean, just some more background on that. People's history of the Inland Empire came together because we felt like the dominant narrative, going back to my statement from earlier, the dominant narrative in our area has always been around this all-American place, or all-American city, in the case of San Bernardino. But a lot of folks will say, like, what American dream? What Americans, like, what all-American city are you talking about, right? And so, like the west side of San Bernardino, right? For me, I'm not from the west side, right? But I know a lot of people from the west side. I didn't live too far from the west side. I lived in nearby Rialto. And so as a kid, I'd always drive by the west side. I'd go to like the Carousel Lawns and places like that, and I'd be like, it fascinated me, right? And so when I learned about Route 66 and I learned about like freeway expansions and the history of that, right? How people talk about these freeway expansions as monuments of racism. I thought about San Bernardino because I thought about the 215, and I thought about how people would talk about, right? And I'm sure, not to put you on the spot, bro, but Freddie knows about this, right? The left turns that would go into downtown, right? And that would basically deviate people from the West Side barrio into downtown just because, you know, people didn't want folks coming in from other parts of the country, from Chicago, other parts of 66 to see the West Side for whatever reason, right? But we know the reason, obviously. And so, you know, I just, you know, and I'm saying this because I was a part of that, the People's History, and my project, my focus was mostly on how freeway segregation impacted San Bernardino's West Side, right? And through my reporting, through my archival research, I was able to learn that there was a whole highway commission that existed. There was one person on that commission who happened to be from San Bernardino, who had powerful business interests, who was able to sway a whole commission and say, well, no, we're going to build we're going to build a freeway like this, so we can have these turns like this, and do this and that, right? And you went from having, and I would have to fact check this stuff on the website, but you had thousands of people down that corridor, 30,000 people a day driving through Mount Vernon Avenue, Route 66. And now you go down there, well, you know, you see the reality, right? And that was years of decline, right? Going back to the slow violence, right? Going from years and years of commerce, years and years of Mexican pride and business ownership to going to nothing, right? To going from, you know, gang violence and things like that. Not because people wanted to kill each other like the media and the narratives that have been dominant want you to believe. It's because of poverty. It's because of survival. It's because of, you know, just the denigration of the community, you know, because people didn't give a shit, honestly, you know? And so that was my focus, and I wanted to do it in a way that was both artistic, that honored the people in that community, but also provided some journalism, right? And, you know, People's History is just that. It's like journalism, it's history, it's all these different narratives. But it's conversations, you know, because the folks that are a part of that project, you know, I mean, great folks, but there's other storytellers in that community that have done even better work than us, arguably, right? Who have told better stories than us, right? So it's also acknowledging that, like, you know, these are great areas to have conversation, academic spaces, but it's going back to that core value of, like, being in the streets, being in the community, you know, like talking to people, right? That's the only way you're going to learn. And I think that's why I appreciated that project, and I thank you for tapping into that. And like you're sharing, encouraging others, because, I mean, that's how we learn about our history, right? It just took me being like, you know what, man, like, I've always been curious about the West Side, and nobody talks about the West Side, nobody ever thinks about its history. So then I started going through the history, and I was like, oh, wow, like I'm hours and hours of archival research going through the California Digital News Archive that is at risk, by the way, right, because of federal funding, right? Going through that stuff and being able to learn about the history, learn about different people, right? Even other reporters that I'm like, they're like veteran reporters that I know now that were like, just like me 30 years ago, on the beat, right, reading their stories in the archives, you know? Like, connecting it all, right? And I think, I don't know, like, it just took a spark for me to be like, you know what, I want to do something about it. And it took professors like Catherine Gudis and others at UCR to give me that chance to be able to merge my journalism with what I think is some pretty cool history information. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Of course. Any other thoughts, any questions? I know I talk a lot, y'all, so please forgive me. So you can interrupt me at any time. Yeah, any thoughts, any questions, y'all?
I have a question for the room.
Yeah.
How many of you saw a warehouse come up close to where you live? Or you can see one now on your drive to work or school? And how many of you have family members or friends with lung issues, asthma, or some type of cancer? So it hits close to home. And even if any of you didn't raise your hand, someone next to you did. So can you, and very quick because we are almost out of time.
Oh, okay, good.
So sorry. But could you advise us on news, media, what to look for to trust it and what to look for to know that maybe it's not as trustworthy or in our best interest?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I mean, please tap into my reporting. Yeah.
Which is, again?
Just didn't tap myself. So I work for KBCR. I'm a public radio reporter. KBCR is public media. So we have PBS and NPR. I'm on the NPR side, National Public Radio. I don't work for NPR, just to clarify, but I'm part of the many member stations that provide local news coverage right now. Sometimes collaborate with NPR. Because of this issue, I also started a local newsroom called the Frontline Observer. Basically, the goal of this outlet is to not only cover local stories on the environment and things like warehousing, but to also try to train, right? Hopefully some public support and funding to train other journalists to do this same kind of reporting, because it's such a dire issue, it's such a big issue that we need more talent, we need more reporters. I love public radio, but public radio, well, all newsrooms are good. If y'all knew the day in, day out to newsrooms, you'd be like, oh man, I feel bad for these people. But like, it's a struggle, right? There's a lot of job shortages, not enough editors, not enough fact checkers. You know, small stations like mine, you have jack of all trades, right? We're fact checking, we're editing each other, right? We're reporting on multiple things. We don't have the luxury, right? And so that's why local newsrooms and things like the Frontline Observer and the work I do is very effective, I think, or at least I try to think I'm being effective in trying to advance hyper-local reporting that you can trust because it's street level, right? So I would say tap into me, tap into KBCR. A media literacy tip, you can, there's a lot of great reporters, there's a lot of great outlets, right? I would even say SoCal News Group, even though I don't agree with their motto of their parent company, Alden Capital, is to basically buy out a paper and say, oh, all your great local news coverage, all your great local reporters, well, we're gonna consolidate to 3 local reporters, from 24 to 3 local reporters now. And we're gonna publish the same story in 14 different papers, even though, and that's what a lot of folks don't know, is when you're reading the Long Beach Telegram or whatever, and then you read the Press Enterprise, you're reading the same stuff, That's the reality of journalism, right? But when you have collaboration, when you have people like me and maybe even other folks that don't consider themselves journalists, right? Again, not to put Freddie on the spot, but Freddie, I consider him a journalist. Because this guy, man, he's like out there in the streets, he's like literally like street level reporting, street level journalism stuff. And maybe he's not following the same rules as me, he's not bothered with objectivity, right? And all that stuff, which is fine. Like, it's the same kind of model. Like, right? I would argue, right, Freddie? What's your goal when you're talking to people, right? You're like trying to learn about them, right?
Just honesty.
Honesty, right? You want the truth. You want that rawness, right? That's journalism to me, personally, right? And so I think sometimes, like, we get stuck in these fucking rigid rules, excuse my language, and that I'm like, y'all, like, this is a part of the problem, is that we're too stuck in these rules. We're too stuck in our boxes and our silos, right? And so, always be critical of your media. Even me. You read some of my stuff, and you're like, hey bro, like, how come you didn't talk to so-and-so, or how come you didn't push them harder? Well, all right, I hear you. Let me push harder next time, right? But that's the whole point. It's accountability. And that's why I love this field too, because when people come to us and they're like, man, you wrote a shitty ass piece, Anthony. What were you thinking, bro? Come on, man. I've had people call me in the middle of the night, be like, man, fuck you, like stuff like that. And it's like, okay, I heard you. Next time I'll do better, right? But like that's a very exaggerated example. But the point I'm trying to make is like, this is the value of our field, right? Is we take in all this stuff, and we always try to do better because we want to inform you, right? And we're not perfect, but that's why it's a two-way exchange, right? So I don't want to be long-winded, but it's a two-way exchange, and media literacy, especially today, with what's going on, not to get into detail, gotta stay critical of every outlet, regardless of it. So I would just like to
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.